Welcome back to the Intuition Incubator. I am so excited for today's podcast. I have with me Chris Niebauer. He earned his PhD in cognitive neuropsychology at the University of Toledo, specializing in the differences between the left and right sides of the human brain. He's also the author of the best-selling book, No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism. So exciting. And the workbook that followed it. He was a professor at a state university in Pennsylvania for 22 years, where he taught courses on consciousness, mindfulness, left and right brain differences, and artificial intelligence. He's been a guest on several podcasts, including Buddha at the Gas Pump and The Chopra Well with Deepak Chopra. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, it's great to be here, Abby.
So, in the opening of this podcast, I talk about our left brain dominant society. And as someone who spent, the first part of my career really caught up in my left brain and not really having an understanding of thinking I was very aware, thinking I was very conscious, and not really understanding what that meant until I began learning more about neuroscience and more about ancient wisdom practices and all of those things. I was saying before we got on this, you just do such an incredible job about speaking to this. And I think I would love to start just by having you, explain that left brain, right brain. And one of the things, I've heard you say is this idea that the left brain always wants to be right. And the difference between thought and consciousness. So let's begin there.
Sure. So just a quick, how do the left and right brain, how do they differ? And there's been so much research on this. It goes back it has a long history. And there are a lot of different ways you can very useful ways you can conceptualize the left and right brain. And no one way is absolutely complete. And so they'll complement each other in a lot of ways. And so when we look at the left brain, of course, we are a species that talks a lot. I mean, that might be one of the things that stands out, because while other animals do use sounds as symbols, so we're not the only species that does that, but we're the only species that engages in language to the extent that we do. Mm-hmm. It gets tied in with our identity. And miraculously, we're the only species that talks when no one's around. And so we have this infamous voice in the head, which is tapping into the same neural mechanism. So as I talk right now, and then maybe pause and then think to myself using the voice in the head, that's the same neural mechanisms involved with the left brain. And so it's that inner voice is just mimicking vocalizations. And so that really sets us apart. In fact, it's very challenging to go for a little while without talking. And it may be interesting, like, well, why do monks do that? They go for a long period of time without engaging in speech. And some of that's because a lot of what we say is just stories that the left brain creates. And the left brain is always out there trying to make sense of the world. So there's sometimes when I talk, people get their first impression, particularly at the beginning of a talk like this, they say, well, you're just have a problem with the left brain. And the left brain is so useful. And so, its magic is really just breathtaking. How do we create sounds? And somehow over the airwaves, like, this makes sense to people. So just to put that straight, what the left brain does is nothing short of miraculous. But those stories that explain the world around us, sometimes we get a little too caught up in them. Sometimes it's almost like a rock rolling down a hill. It gains all this momentum, and it's really hard to change its course or to stop it. In fact, when you look at intrusive thoughts, the research is pretty clear that the most common form of intrusive thoughts is the voice in the head. And so when I talk and ask people, I said, well, what would be one thing you'd love to be able to do if you just had a magic wand? And most people, they'd like to turn off the voice in the head. Mm. And so one of the things I like to do, and just to show how difficult this task is, just for your audience right now, let's just take 5 seconds. So we'll take a 5-second pause, and all I want you to do is not talk to yourself using your inner voice. Go. Yes. So what probably something like, oh, I can't do this, or oh, this is silly. And so that tells us something that's very interesting about our species. We have this helpful machine in the left brain that helps us figure out things going on in the world. It spins scenarios, hypotheses, but it doesn't seem like it's under our will. And so that is one hint about this mechanism that if it was under our will, then it would really be like who we are. But the very fact that we can't control it suggests that it's just a part of the brain that's doing what its function evolved to do, which is to look around the world, look at the data, and then create hypotheses based on that data. But like you said earlier, here's the trick with the left brain. It doesn't create a hypothesis like maybe this or maybe that. Its hypotheses are conclusive. It just assumes this is what's out there. And that has to do with that sense of, well, we know we're right. And so we've got the left brain creating hypotheses about the world, not in a questioning or critical manner, but in a way that it just assumes is right. And then we've got this counterbalancing system in the right brain. One of my favorite ways to describe it is V.S. Ramachandran, who's a very famous neuroscientist, and he called the right brain the devil's advocate. So the right brain's job is to question these stories of the left brain. When they get too far out of line, the right brain steps in and it does a course correction on the left brain. And so we have these experiences, throughout the day. Imagine you're just driving along and the speed limit's 55, but you're going 60, 65. The left brain, even the right brain, lets that go. It's not past any threshold. But if you end up going 75, 80, suddenly the right brain kicks in and it says, this is too big of an anomaly. This is we're actually speeding. And so there's all kinds of things in life that we can do with this. If you gain a little bit of weight, there's all kinds of things where the right brain will let a little slide, but when it gets too far out of touch with reality, then the right brain steps in. And we know this from patients who have right brain damage. And when patients have right brain damage, then that devil's advocate's offline. And in these patients, the left brain can make up amazing stories and have absolute confidence in them. And so these patients, because their right brain had, say, a stroke, they're paralyzed on the left side of their body. But the left brain doesn't know this. And so with the devil's, it's just holding to its old story, like everything's fine. And so they'll say, well, of course I can move my hand. And their hand's sitting there paralyzed. But one patient in particular was interesting because Dr. Ramachandran said, well, if you can do this with your hand, point to my nose. And the patient actually hallucinated. She said, well, of course, my hand is pointing to your nose right now. And so what these stories tell us is that the inventive nature of the left brain has no limits. It will make up stories. And of course, the self is one of these stories, who we are, who we think we are. And the right brain acts as a counterbalancing mechanism that help keep us in line with reality. But there's a little bit more mystical magic going on with the right brain, because once we stop talking, and so the right brain understands speech, but speech it's not obsessed with speech, and it doesn't mind silence. And so the right brain is pretty good at exploring reality without linguistic interpretations. And of course, two of our favorite linguistic interpretations are the future and the past that most of us get so obsessed with. In fact, the data is pretty remarkable that during our waking day, now I think this is just modern humans. I don't think this goes back to our ancestors. I think they were far more in touch with reality. But modern humans, we spend half of our waking day in these made up stories, mind wandering, not being where we're at, not being when we're at, but using this mental simulation to transport into some future that might happen or the ego wishes would happen, or into some past that we think happened, but maybe we're not quite happy with it.
So how do you know, right? Like how you're you're saying this is a story. How do you know that's a story, right? Because so many people, particularly like right now in this moment of time, there's so much certainty. Like I know what I know this. And you're saying that's a story. And I'm sure people listening to this are going, well, it's not a story. Like that's my truth. How do you know it's a story and it's not truth?
Well, let's just take one very inventive story, a useful story of the left brain. And that's the story of who we think we are, the self, the ego. And it's a very useful story because maybe the world will work a little more easily if I have this illusion that I have a car and that I have a house and then I pay my bills and maybe it works. But then you say, like, how do you know? That's a story. And so we could take it a little bit deeper. And, when you ask, what's the difference between thinking and consciousness? I think that's one of the main mistakes. That mistake is prevalent all through psychology. It's actually through the consciousness research. And when you start getting good, and actually I'm working on a new book. It should be out maybe in the next year, hopefully a little sooner than that. But and it goes through what I call the thinking illusion.
Yeah.
And how you can show that thoughts are not what they appear to be. Because when you have a thought, it's very seductive. It feels real. It feels like even the voice in the head can feel very real at times. And I'll just give you one exercise to sort of dissolve the illusion of thinking a little bit. And anytime you're maybe bothered by the voice in the head, do a simple comparison between reality, consciousness in the here and now, and the voice in the head, which pales in comparison to it. And so right now, the sound of my voice is directly in conscious experience. Now, if you just repeat a few of those lines in the voice in the head, the quality isn't very good. Are you even sure it's your voice? So there's all these explorations we can do. So when you hear the voice in the head, and the voice in the head is so certain that you failed that test, the voice in the head is so certain that the work meeting is going to be disastrous, and it's certain, just like you said. And so turn the light of consciousness on that voice in the head, and what you'll find is that it's not nearly as powerful as you thought it was. And you can do this by focusing on the quality. Is it your voice in the head? Can you turn it up? Can you turn it down a little bit? And you start realizing that the voice in the head isn't as powerful as you thought it was. In fact, it's very flimsy. It's a very shadowy illusion of direct conscious experiences. And so one of the practices I think is very powerful, and it's been around for a very long time in so many different ways, is to focus on direct conscious experiences in the here and now. Visual experiences, and the sound of music is a really helpful one for a lot of people. And even something as simple, one of my favorite things is just a sip of your tea. So you take a sip of tea, and you let that experience be center stage. That's direct conscious experience. And while you're doing that, and you're really going deep into it's a very joyful thing. I mean, something as simple as sipping your tea in the morning can be an amazingly joyful experience because it's consciousness without thinking. And I think a lot of us are already doing this. A lot of people, they get up in the morning, they have their coffee, maybe they sit on the porch, and what they're doing is they're preparing for a day of thinking. And you do this, you sit out on the porch, and you taste your coffee, and now you can go out and now the rest of the day might be thinking, but at least you've done your morning meditation. And so when people say, well, what's meditation all about? All meditation is direct conscious experience without thinking about it. And so one of the things I like to talk about is the definition of thinking. And so Neisser, the father of cognitive psychology back in the 60s, he defined thinking, well, he called it cognition, but it's the same thing. He defined it as any sensory process. So that's consciousness. You're eating your food, and you're looking at a sunset. So any sensory process that is transformed, reduced or elaborated, and then stored and used at some later point. So our thoughts are not mere images of reality. Our thoughts are transformed versions of what we experience. So you have dinner, it's a wonderful dinner, and you're mindful and you're enjoying every bit of it. Then on the way home, you think about it. You create this mental simulation, which is transformed. So you elaborate some things, and then you edit out some other things. So it's not reality. It's a simulation that's usually edited by your ego. And then that gets stored. And then later on, you call it a memory. And one of the things that my students would find rather shocking is when I would tell them that none of your memories ever happened. And people think, well, that doesn't feel. See, you said, we feel so confident.
Yeah, sure.
And you can get people, and they'll be on the stand, maybe at a trial, and they'll be so confident. They'll say, this is what happened. And it just simply isn't. That's what you think happened. And this is why when we take a peek at memory, particularly memory for like eyewitness testimony, it's just absolutely dreadful. But their confidence isn't. Their confidence is way up here. And because we don't understand the difference between thinking and consciousness, your thoughts are a simulation of your conscious experiences. And maybe they evolved to help us solve problems. Maybe they evolved, one of the things, like when we take our dog for a walk, our poor Yorkie, he gets himself in trouble the same way every time. He walks around a mailbox and then he gets stuck. And he just tries to like effort his way through. If I really try to dig in, I'll get out of this problem. And any adult kid can figure it out in seconds. You have to back up, undo, the mess you've gotten yourself into, and then you're fine. And so the thinking mind, used appropriately, can be pretty clever. And it gets out of a mess here and there. But it's convincing more and more as I get into this, we probably don't have to think more than maybe 40 minutes a day, maybe a half an hour. The rest is just direct conscious experience.
So how can that be? Like, why would we want to stop thinking so much? This is really what when people are talking about things, they'll literally say, I just need to think more about it. I just need to think about this and decide this and that. Like, why would people want to listen to this and say, okay, I'm going to practice trying to think less?
Well, you have to be careful because that type of advice, that can get you in trouble because the thinking mind has it works in a very interesting way. Like if I say, don't think of the number 13,
yeah,
you start thinking of it. And, in that sense of like, particularly people who have trouble with thoughts and particularly intrusive thoughts. And you say, well, maybe let's try to stop thinking. And that just backfires because then you end up thinking more. It's like the person who tries to go to sleep because they have an early interview and they're like, I'm just not going to think.
Yeah, right.
And it just gets way, way worse. And so, but be your own, you're the experiencer. And if the thoughts aren't giving you trouble, I would say that's fine. In fact, one of the most common questions I get is, I like to daydream. I don't like to be in reality that much. And so what's the big problem if I daydream a lot? And my only caution with that is that you might have a fun daydream and it might be kind of an escape from what you're doing. But every time we're not in reality and we're in the mind, we're in this mental simulation, it feels like it gives it momentum. It feels like it empowers it. And then the more it gets empowered, the more difficult it is to turn off. And so if you are thinking all day and then you go to yoga and you're doing downward facing dog or something, and you're like, well, I need to, you're thinking, you're not doing yoga, you're thinking about yoga. Yeah. And so it can get more and more, and most of this stuff, so I got my PhD in cognitive neuropsychology, but most of it was experientially based. And so when I was in my 20s, I was just a neurotic mess.
Yeah. What was
And
what was the name of your very first book? It was so perfect.
The Neurotic's Guide to Avoiding Enlightenment.
Yeah. I was like, oh my God, that was the first part of my life.
Yeah, and a lot of people absolutely related to that. It was way too long of a title. It wasn't something that a lot of people could appeal to, but some people thought if they were in the mess that I was in, then they definitely related to it because you would get these brief moments of not thinking, and then those became very desirable, and so you'd try to get in more and more enlightenment, and the more you get focused on enlightenment, the more it moves into the distance. Right. and so that's so I thought, well, I'm going to come up with a book like let's just avoid enlightenment altogether, and that stuck with me. People ask, "Are you enlightened?" I'm like, that doesn't really work too well with me. I don't think about enlightenment. I just want to stay in reality. And I think that's a decent plan to stay in reality as much as I can throughout the day, because this thinking, again, really useful. But here's another thing, and I used to have my students do this because it was very powerful. Because some thoughts turn out to be accurate, but actually, what we did over the semester, and I had them keep a journal, and it would be every thought you have, I want you to rate how confident you are that it's going to turn out exactly like you think it is. Mm. And by the end of the semester, the highest rate of accuracy was 50%. Most people were shocked that their thinking wasn't as accurate
of how they thought it was going to turn out.
Yeah. So you think, you worry all night because these test results are coming back, and then they're fine.
Yeah.
And so this mechanism of the thinking mind, it can be looked at as an evolutionary survival mechanism that's grounded in paranoia, because it's from a survival, like I'm trying to get this DNA to survive. From that perspective, it's better to be safe than sorry. And so it's geared towards the negative. And I think that's why these moments where people put down their thinking for a little bit, they're so blissful. They're blissful because they don't have that heavy weight of thinking. The thinking machine is trying to get this body to survive. So it's always quite serious. But our true self, and this is one of the ways, like you say, well, who are we? Right. And the thinking mind is a sort of this, mask or it's a linguistic narrative that we sort of got tied into, mostly because of our culture. There are cultures in the world that are not tied into this narrative. And but consciousness, there is no other way I can go through this existence except to put consciousness as fundamental to our identity. And in science, of course, there's this people trying to figure out consciousness, which is trying to use the thinking mind to figure out something that is impossible. Consciousness, at least from my perspective, it's not a mystery to be solved. It's an experience to be had. And so there's no mystery. There's nothing to figure out with consciousness. It's here. Mm. And it's remarkable when you see cultures, and I often talk about the Pitahan, this culture in South America that is very much like you might imagine our ancestors. They're hunter-gatherers. You could put them in the woods. They get their food. They know how to live in nature. And they almost never think. Thinking is very rare for them.
And they're happy.
And every Westerner that visits them, the first impression is that they are the happiest people on the planet. Their level of laughter, and this is remarkable because they live with malaria, they live with hardships that so many of us could never really imagine. And how can this group of people be so happy? And the defining characteristic of their culture is that they are in the immediacy of experience, which is to say, their life is led by consciousness rather than thinking about it.
This makes me think of a while back, I was traveling with a friend and we were bobbing around in this beautiful water, and it was, just gorgeous setting. And she kept saying, "Oh, this is what I love. I just love being in nature. I love look at that. That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful." And I remember saying, "I want to like be present, but I feel like we're not being present if we just keep naming everything that we're seeing and how present we are." And
Yeah.
so it was like, okay, let me just try and be present and like stop saying, "Oh, I'm having this great experience right now. This is awareness." Like, no, that's thought.
Yeah. And that's a symptom of our culture. You can go anywhere right now and you'll see people take pictures with their
Yeah.
phones. Instead of being in the experience, they're trying to create a representation of it for the future, or something to save and then talk about instead of just having the experience.
Right, right. And so, yeah, I remember a few years ago I was at an event and I was very insecure with this group of people I was at. And I remember my mind was just going and going and going. And I thought it reminds me of like that one of the exercises you gave. I was like, I am so tired of this voice in my head. I'm going to write down every time I have an insecure thought. And I literally I wasn't listening to anything that was happening. Like we were being lectured. I wasn't listening to it. I was just writing down every single thing. Oh, she's beautiful. Oh, she's the favorite. Oh, like this voice in my head. Right. And by noon, like I was just so bored with this voice that I was able to finally just have an experience. Right. And which allowed me to be in it. But you use this word reality. You've said it several times now. I want to be in reality. What is your definition then of reality? Because lots of people will say, well, I'm a realist. And so that means blah, 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 blah.
Other than direct conscious experience, that's always my test of reality. So in other words, can you experience it? And so just I talk about ownership because it's one of these amazing illusions that so many of us have fallen for. We believe that we can own something.
Mm.
And you say, well, how do you know ownership's an illusion? I mean, it really defines our culture. And I've got a piece of paper here that says I own this or that. Well, can you directly experience ownership? I mean, how in the world do you own this thing or this property? What's the conscious experience of that? You can't. You can try. You could say, well, I have this piece of paper. That's a piece of paper. That's not, I mean, it's all a collective hallucination.
Mm.
And so ownership is just one of a long list of government's another one. And it's true. People go to these buildings and they work and they do things. And the building's real because you can experience it. But there's all kinds of fictions that surround things like government. They don't exist in the real world. They exist in this abstract thought created world. And that might be I'm not coming down on these. Maybe they're useful. They're just not real. So an illusion could still be useful. It's just not real. And so unless I can directly consciously experience something, it's just not part of reality. And what we find is the left brain falls for these over and over again. The university, education. Yeah. People say, well, and this is one of the things that got very, the more, in the new book, I'm exploring over the last 200 years, we went much deeper into this abstract world and we left reality at the same time. And so we are really caught up in this hallucination of education. Like, I need a PhD, I need a degree. Well, do you need the degree or do you want the knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially now, right? Like I have a kid who is in that age, and there's so many kids now that don't go to university, right? Because like when I was growing up, it was, you got your education and that's how that went, and there's so many people that opt out of it now and they, go on to do a lot of great things. I've like, this is so deep. It's hard to wrap your thinking mind around, right?
Well, because we've been kind of lulled into, we've been hypnotized by the thinking mind for so long that it's very strange. It has a very strange feeling when all these things like work, people get up and they go to work and they believe in work. They think this place called work exists. Yes, the building exists, your coworkers, all that's real. But this identity of work is a fiction. In fact, it's interesting in, I think it was Sapiens. I think that's the book. The story of the first corporation was told where Peugeot, the car maker, had this brilliant idea of like how to evade any responsibility. And so what he did was he had his lawyers and everyone, they drew up this fictitious company he called it the same name, Peugeot. But it was a brilliant thing. It was a brilliant abstraction because now the company's responsible for everything. Even though the company doesn't exist. And when you say, well, how do you know the company isn't real? I say, show me the company. And people will walk around and say, well, here's the building. I'm like, yeah, I know, but show me the company. And of course, the company only exists as a left brain fiction. And we're falling for it. So there's another book, boy, the title's I'm going to blank on the title, but it goes through how pervasive this is in the sense that we don't sue individuals anymore. All we do is, even though individuals did these things, we sue companies. We sue abstractions that don't even exist. Well, think about, we're so deep in this left brain abstract world right now that we even fall for cryptocurrency. I mean, cryptocurrency has no physicality to it at all.
Right.
It's an absolute idea. And unless it holds itself up by a collective illusion, by lots of people believing in it at the same time, it would absolutely disappear. And that's why, like, I think it was Warren Buffett who didn't fall for this. He said, I wouldn't pay $25 for all the cryptocurrency in the world because he knew it was an illusion.
But isn't it all an illusion? Like, I mean, like you could say the same thing about government, right? Like it would just, it's held up by a collective illusion.
Absolutely. And so is this idea of who you think you are.
Yeah, let's get back to that. I love this about identity and the ego, because we get so attached to, I'm the kind of person I'm the kind of person that thinks that, and so attached to this just abstraction of lies that we, and Gurdjieff refers to like buffers, all the buffers that we have to put in place to continue to believe these things about ourselves, be they things that we deem are good or things that we deem are bad. So speak to that a little bit.
So the Buddha gave some advice on how to see through the illusion of the self. And there are two basic things, is there any stability? And this is a really good one because you can watch how the self will change very quickly. And one environment, you'll put on one self, and then 5 seconds later, you're playing with your kids and you're a different self. And then you stub your foot and then you're a completely different self. And so the self is always in change. It's always in flux. So if it's always changing, it's not the stable thing we think it is. But another one I thought was really interesting is the idea of volition and control. And so if the self had if it really was this pilot, this captain who's sitting behind the eyes, kind of running the show, then it should be our lives would be completely different. Humanity would be completely different. No one would ever have a panic attack because it'd start having panicky thoughts and they'd go, well, I don't want to do that. They would shut it off.
Right.
I mean, being healthy wouldn't be a problem. You just go to the gym. And yet, most actual humans, they struggle all the time with these things because there's not this absolute commander who just says things and they happen. And so the will isn't quite what we think it is. But the way I look at it, and for me, this was really a profound experience when I realized that if we do take reality to be that we can consciously experience, and that thinking is all of these simulations of those conscious experiences, well, what about the self? If the self is real, we should be able to experience it. And you can look in the mirror and you can say, well, that's my face. Fine. You can look at your hand and you can say, well, that's my hand. But to whom does the hand belong? To who does the face belong? Can you experience that?
Right. Yeah. It's like sort of like when like Michael Singer talks about, you look in the mirror when you're 10 years old, you see one body, that's you. You look in the mirror now, you see a totally different body. It's still you. The consciousness is you. It is the observer of all of those things.
And the interesting thing about the observer is, particularly when you take it as raw experience, is it rarely has a story attached to it.
Right.
It doesn't have, it's not, it's the self as a Chris, you know, you know, is it 57 years old? You know, is it, you know, an author, you know, all these like identities that we try to attach to it. As soon as you go to, okay, what can I experience? And all what you experience is the here and now.
Hmm.
And if that's really who we are, then it's a game changer because all these other things are going to change. Maybe I'll be poor tomorrow. You know, at some point, this identity will completely fail and it'll go offline. But does consciousness go offline? It doesn't have any personal identity to it. So that's tough for the ego to handle.
Yeah, because the ego wants to be all these things. And as you say, experiencing the here and now, I can hear like some of the audience, you know, thinking, well, okay, the here and now, let's say in that moment is they just lost a big deal at work or something like that. The here and now is, oh, this sucks. This is terrible. This is, no, that's not what you're saying about experiencing the here and now. That's the story about the here and the now.
And it's not in my own life. It took a long time.
How did you speak to how you, because you're obviously very studied it, like, you know, a lot of these things. You're not, this didn't all pop into your head just from experience. You know, you were able to put words to it maybe from the study. How did you come to this?
It was a couple insights about the nature of thought. And so I had been, you know, plagued by neuroses and this power, these thoughts that, well, you're going to die any second. And it was my father's death that happened unexpectedly. And I had seen how powerful death can be and how much suffering it can cause. And so it became the enemy. Like, you know, this is something I have to escape and somehow work on. And I was terrified of it. And so thoughts of death were just continuous throughout my day. In fact, it was very difficult to even have a normal conversation with someone because the thinking mind was in such overdrive. And it just became very frustrating in a moment. I said, I don't care anymore. Do your worst. If you're going to kill me, just do it now. And just, you know, it was a moment of absolute surrender. And then the strangest thing happened. It's like everything was peaceful and quiet for a little bit. And this really freaked me out because I didn't know anything. This was in my 20s, early 20s. I didn't know anything. And I had read some Alan Watts, but I didn't really know the power of surrender or how you do it. And he might say, well, how did you, because when I tell the story, people say, well, that sounds really good. How do you surrender?
Right.
And the problem is what we're talking about is a really interesting paradox because the thinking mind wants what it can't have. It's absence.
It's right. It wants it to go away.
Yeah. The thinking mind wants itself to go away.
Right.
And that just, you know, you start becoming, it becomes like a comedy of sorts because you realize like this thing I've been fighting. So I am fighting for this, but it's the thing that's growing stronger the more I try to fight it.
Right.
And then that's why surrender is so powerful because they come at it from a different place. You know, like we might say intuition is different than thinking. Consciousness is different than thinking. And so once you come at it from a different place, your true identity, you know, consciousness, not the thinking, all of a sudden these miraculous things happen. But it's hard to, how do we talk about it?
Right.
And we're as humans, we're always trying to bottle up consciousness in a way that we can talk about it, the way the thinking mind can understand. But the thinking mind is very limited. And, you know, understanding it's like somehow bottling the universe. You know, and it's very difficult to take something as vast and magical as consciousness and get this limited left brain process to somehow create a thought about it.
So is intuition consciousness? Is intuition right? I mean, the intuition, is it in the right brain? Is it consciousness?
The thing, and I find this in the research in psychology, people do confuse thinking errors. And they'll say, well, how do we know we can't trust intuition? And then there's something like 350 thinking errors that have been studied. And sometimes these will be thought of as, well, this is why intuition goes wrong. Because, they confuse poor thinking and the errors of thinking with intuition.
Right, not the same thing.
Yeah,
Right.
but one of my favorite ways of looking at intuition is knowing without knowing how you know.
Yeah.
And because it's all beyond what the thinking mind can process. And so the thinking mind just stands in absolute ignorance. Like, how did this happen? And for me, the intuition comes for me through writing. And almost nothing. And so there are little pieces in my book that I would say I wrote, and they're not very interesting. But anything that was interesting came from this mysterious place that my thinking mind cannot conceptualize. It just happens. And it happens, a walk. And for me, walks are one of the ways that these moments happen. But they happen all kinds of places. They're unpredictable. The thinking mind can't create a process to capture it. It's something that's so far beyond the thinking mind. The thinking mind is at a total loss. And so there's no way to explain it because it is consciousness. It is that higher intelligence that shares some of genuine intelligence with me playing this role of a separate being. And it shares that greater intelligence with me as a gift, as a blessing, from time to time.
And where does it exist then? Where does consciousness exist? Right? Like, where are we getting this intel from that we suddenly have an experience?
It's the only thing that exists. And so one of the things people look at and they say, well, there's this, and again, we have this story, and it's an amazing story, the Big Bang and planets forming, and that's maybe a useful story, but it's still a story. And so what we have in our existence, we have consciousness, and everything else is a story. And that's fine. I'm not, make your stories, but recognize the difference. And so consciousness is fundamental. It's all there is. And you say, well, I don't know. I mean, it feels like consciousness is, because neuroscience, I love using neuroscience as a guide, but this idea that the brain somehow conjures up consciousness, I'm not sure that's really ever going to pan out too well. But we have this experience, and we say, it does feel like my experience is limited. Like I feel like a single being, and you feel like a single being. And then consciousness has this way of being very playful, like when you think about what we call reality, it looks like a bunch of solid stuff, but then it's really 99.99% empty space.
Right.
And when we take a look at time, there's only the present moment. That's absolutely clear. But the past and the future, they're kind of these playful things that they're not real. But reality seems to have this playful energy with it of being what it's not. And that's one of my all-time favorite quotes. Alan Watts said it really nice. He said, when it plays at being everything else. So when consciousness plays, it plays at being me, you, all the things we call the material world. And when you look, that sounds like a strange thought, I know, for some people, but when you look at so many cultures, try to find out what is fundamental. And we're talking about ancient cultures, and they would find what we call the four elements, fire, water, earth, air, and you could see these pop up all over the world in different cultures. Yeah. But what they missed is that the people missed two things about this. One is the kids play with these all the time. Kids play in the dirt. And one of the most fascinating things about dirt is that you can separate it and then you put it back together again as if nothing ever happened. Same thing with water. You can splash. You can, if you look at one of my favorites, is the fountain at the Bellagio. You see this, they just goes up, and then one source suddenly becomes 1,000 individual drops of water. Yeah. But then it goes back to the source. And so the four elements, what they're representing is an important quality of consciousness. Consciousness is just like this. It has this ability to pretend to be separate and then go back to its source. And so there's really one consciousness, but it seems to have this playful ability to be what it's not, to be separate. And I sometimes look at it as kind of a cosmic escape room. And when people look at the escape rooms, why do we do this? We pay money to get lost and then to try to find our way out.
Yeah.
And maybe consciousness is like this. It plays this escape room, except instead of going to some place downtown, the escape room is me and it's you and it's all your listeners. You're stuck in this and you're trying to find your way back home.
Yeah.
And so how do you find it? Stop thinking. That's the first little puzzle. You say, okay, I'm going to stop thinking. Wow. And then all of a sudden, consciousness has a way. The more you can distinguish thinking from consciousness, and the more you spend time in consciousness without thinking, all of a sudden it doesn't feel like your consciousness anymore. And it's like that drop sort of goes back into the source. Mm. And you realize like there's really just one.
We're all one. We're all one. And what would it be like to be in that spot? I don't know if you've achieved that, to be in that spot 24/7 with all of the inundation that we take in with our five senses, but there's a quiet and a peacefulness in that is just, it's untouchable. And everything dissipates, all the strife, all the argument, all the separation just goes away. Like, how did we get to where we are, where there is so much separation? And, and I've heard you talk about how the left brain, categorizes things and files things, right? And of course, there's so much about that filing system. And then we just believe it, hook, line, and sinker. Oh, I'm filing that there. This goes in that category. And then we end up having all these discussions, this mental masturbation about right and wrong and yada, yada. And I mean, and this is you step outside your door, that this is what is happening in the world 24/7.
And one way is it is suffering. It's not the joy that you feel. But one way to consider is that there's no escaping consciousness. It's all there is. And so even in our state of division, it's still consciousness playing a game of being what it's not. And the game just gets more and more outrageous as time goes. When my son was little, I used to like hold him over my knee and pretend like he was going to drop, and he'd be all frightened and, oh, don't do it. And when I found it, like I'd have to do it a little bit more every time. The game had to get a little more outrageous. And I think that's what us humans, we're exploring. We're playing more outrageous games. We're categorizing more and more, becoming what we're not. Because when you think about it, when you consider consciousness, maybe, what would it be like to be an all-knowing, all-peaceful, sitting on your, lotus position and just meditating throughout eternity? And this is playing off some old Hindu stories, but what if consciousness decided to stir it up a little bit? What if I forgot about who I am?
Right.
What if I became what I'm not, individual consciousness that believes that they're a self, that they believe in their ego, and get into adventures. But to get into adventures, you have to have the thought of losing and winning. And these are all inventions. They're not real, but they're all just playful. But the trick of that mechanics is it's hard to create a system where you win all the time. And so, I think it was at the end of No Self, I was telling this like parable, like what if you owned your own casino? Think about how boring this would be. Because as you played the machines, if you won as the player, but then you'd lose as the owner.
Right.
But then if you lost, right. There's just no way it's boring.
Right.
Let's think about it this way. What if you own the casino, but you could walk in and just take some kind of memory thing that you'd forget that you owned it?
Yeah.
In other words, you forget that you're one consciousness.
Then you could really enjoy winning.
Then you get to enjoy winning. But the only way you do that, you have to put in the mechanics that you might lose.
Right. Right. And the times, this idea of adventurous, right? Like the times that I've had that, I have actually had that happen where like I was in meditation and I heard this voice just say to me, what would happen if you just lost your identity you just stopped thinking, well, I'm the kind of person who this. And within a minute, it was like, well, then I guess I could move to Florida. Like we were here, 2 months later, like the freedom that comes from losing that grip on who we think we are, and I can hear, when you say, well, just what if we just sit on the porch and, whatever. And then everybody's probably thinking, well, what are you going to do? Nothing all day? You're going to be nothing. You're going to create nothing with your life. Like, and that's all story, right?
Yeah. And it's not even, ironically, I love that story. Gary Weber, I don't know if you've heard it, but he was running all these multi-million-dollar companies and the voice in his head, and he was meditating and doing very similar things. And it just stopped one day and nothing changed. He still ran the companies. Yeah. Like nothing changed. So we really don't need that voice. Yeah. It's giving the appearance that it's way more necessary in life, particularly at our place in evolution. And we've evolved so much where we're not dealing with the problems our ancestors did. For a lot of us, we know where food is coming from. We have shelter, and so it's an outdated. It's like running like the first system of Windows, like you're running Windows 1.0,
right?
And it's just an old system with a lot of flaws in it, and we just don't need it. And I think like your move to Florida, that's when you stop thinking, not effortless. You can't put effort. You can't say you must stop thinking. That's not good. But if you go through and recognize when you're thinking, when you're not, and you recognize the nature, particularly the illusory nature of thinking itself, then all of a sudden these wonderful intuitions get to step in.
Yeah.
And if the way this path that I'm on, it would be very strange for me to think about what I'm going to do, especially any kind of big decision. I would never think it over because I know the thinking process is so flawed. But what I would like to do, and you see this, Gandhi talked about it, when anything really big came up, you would meditate, which is to say, you would be in consciousness rather than thinking about it.
Right.
And when you're in consciousness, you're tapping into, and again, what we call intuition, but you're tapping into a much greater intelligence. And unlike thinking, which is at best right 50% of the time, intuition has like 100% success rate.
Right. So how do you have you achieved this to the point that your thinking mind is not online and you're able to, develop this sort of third force inside yourself where you're observing yourself move through your day with awareness, right? Because we're so mechanical.
Whenever I'm not me, it's achieved, which is to say, the ego can't be enlightened. It's stuck.
Yeah. Right.
It's so, but these moments do come quite often throughout the day. And actually, I think, and I'd love to do a study on this because I think that for your listeners, it happens to them too, far more than they know.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is when the thinking mind turns back on, from its biased perspective, it only considers when the thinking mind was on.
Right.
And so I was zoned out that time. No, you weren't zoned out. You were conscious. You were experiencing, like you go for a walk through nature and all of a sudden maybe thinking goes down a little bit and you're very peaceful and it's very joyful. But the thinking mind comes back on and says, oh, you were out of it for a little bit. And so what I do as a practice, and I have my students do this, is you just put a bunch of Post-it notes around. Was I just thinking? And what you'll catch is like, wow, I wasn't thinking back then. And yeah, that was pretty pleasant. That was really enjoyable. And you just, and you catch yourself, an interesting phrase, I guess, but you catch yourself not being yourself.
Right.
You're not conjuring up an ego. And this experience first happened to me. It was in the middle of my neurosis. And I didn't have a car. I was riding a bike and got a flat. And I had fixed the flat. And then what I had noticed is I just was fixing the flat. And I look back and I go, wow, that was really peaceful.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was so peaceful to just fix the flat. And that's what Zen is the essence, you're cutting carrots. You're not thinking about it.
Right. It's not like, oh my God, my tire, this is heavy. I can't believe this is going to be late. It's it's the being function. You're just being in the moment while you're doing the things. You don't have to stop doing things.
In fact, you'll probably be more productive the less you think. And it's, one of my favorite audiences. I gave this talk to a bunch of medical doctors, and that's a fun one because they've used their thinking mind and it's been very useful. But one of the things you point out is that when these big insights take place, and you take like Fleming with like penicillin, and I have a wonderful little quote that he had where he wasn't thinking about curing disease. He was consciously observing. So it was his conscious observation that the penicillin had an effect on mold. That's what led to the breakthrough. It wasn't a bunch of sitting around thinking and pondering. And even when you take a look, so Einstein's favorite thought, it's a story he told that kind of went like this, where he was imagining, and it was a multisensory thing. So he was imagining like if he jumped off a roof and he had an apple, and as he was falling, he let go of the apple. And so both, gravity, it would look like the apple's floating. And that may have been a thought, but it was very deep into sensory. It wasn't very abstract. He was feeling what it was like to jump off this building and watch the apple fall with him. And that was his insight for his theory of relativity. And so, and some of these thoughts can be useful, but you might notice if you do this, you're probably not thinking as much as you think you're thinking.
Yeah. And so what advice do you have for people? Because I can hear people listening to this thinking, all right, I'm going to stop thinking. I'm going to stop thinking. I'm going to stop thinking, and we talk about meditation a lot, right? And sitting quietly and listening to all of your thoughts is not meditation, right? Meditation isn't actually like a thing. It's a state. Right. What is how do you, for people that are very new to this, what do you suggest that they try?
They try something that our educational system has completely left out of the picture. Yeah. And that is our practicing of attention. And so when modern neuroscience met up with a bunch of monks in the 90s, the neuroscientists thought they had attention figured out. And they thought, well, our attention is very limited. And, and then he met these monks who were like, no, I can focus on something pretty much as long as I want. And that was shocking. They had to rewrite the book or throw their book out. And so we're all ill prepared for this. So how do we get into this? Because I remember, particularly when I was incredibly neurotic, I was like, well, I heard about this thing called meditation. I'm going to try it. And I would time myself and, these silly things where I didn't get it. I didn't get that the whole point of meditation is just to experience senses alone without thinking about them. But even that was challenging because I could do it for a second or two, but then it wouldn't work and then I would give up. And so we have to realize that so many of us, our attention is so poorly trained that meditation is going to be really difficult. And so if you're going to do mindful eating, say, don't worry about the meal. If you're just starting, you're a beginner. No one would say go out and run 26 miles. You start off incredibly slow, small little steps. And I would say just be conscious of the first bite of your food. Then the rest you could mindlessly, put away. But just be conscious of that first bite. And that's something that it's doable.
Yeah.
And then I say, okay, why don't you go for 2? Go slow though. Go painfully, sillily slow. Just go so slow that you catch your thinking mind off guard.
Right.
Because your thinking mind is like, that's fine. I'm going to torture you with thoughts all night, but I'll give you 5 seconds.
Right. Yeah, I just did a solo episode about how we have this, we know that it takes effort to get into physical fitness. We are aware of that. And we know we're not going to walk into a gym and pick up the greatest weight, but we don't have a sense of the practice that's required to build the mental fitness to build that capacity. That it starts with something as quick as 5 seconds and you have to practice it. And if you stop practicing it, it will go away again, just like the muscle goes away if you stop lifting weights.
Absolutely. And that's another thing too. Once people get it down, so they practice and they go really slow where they focus on their breath. Maybe they focus on a walk but you start off real 5 seconds. I want to focus on walking. Then I can let the thinking mind have its fun. And then 10 seconds. And then you start getting, and all of a sudden this peace takes over your life. And you're like, this is pretty good. I'm enjoying, this is nice. And then you stop meditating.
Right. I think I've done that. It comes right back. I can attest to that.
Me too. And the moment you stop, the thinking mind is just sort of waiting it out. Like, I'm going to have my fun again.
Yeah, it's waiting you out. Oh my God, that's fabulous. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. Anything that you would like to share with I know you've got a book coming out. We're going to put all of that in the show notes. But what do you really want the audience to know? Like, what do you feel like is just so important that people begin to understand and why?
It's a meme. It's gotten popular, and I actually love that it's becoming popular. Let it get more and more popular, and that is, don't believe everything you think. And that summarizes so much in a one-liner, and it's calling up the right brain's devil's advocates to kind of lead a life of question. And these thoughts come up, but you don't have to believe in them. And maybe you can't make them go away, but they lose their power over you when you don't take them very seriously. When you understand, I'm 57. I've been doing this 30 years. My poison, it's not gone.
Yeah.
I just don't, take it very seriously. And so thoughts, maybe, and it is some people like Gary Weber, it just went out. And there are stories amongst, they just don't think anymore.
Right.
I don't think we're all that blessed. I think a lot of us ordinary people, we're going to have thoughts. But if we can crank up the right brain and be critical, like, okay, thought, you're so talented. Did you turn out this time to be correct? No, you didn't. And when you get a little bit better at that, so it's a meme that goes around, don't believe everything you think, but you can test that out for yourself. Like, why shouldn't I believe everything I think? Well, don't listen to me. Go into your own life, get a journal, and start testing out how accurate these thoughts are. And then once you go through it a little bit, then you're talking, you directly experienced for yourself that this is a flawed system.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I don't have to tell you to don't believe what you think. You don't believe it because you have the data right in front of you.
You had the experience, right? And that's how we learn, through experience. Yeah. Don't believe everything you think. Okay. You heard it here for the gazillionth time.
Yeah, we've all heard that. And I don't want it to go away, though.
No.
I think we're at a point, we need to focus on that. And let's get it to the point that we really don't believe everything that we think.
Because what would the world be like? I mean, truly, we're literally on the heels of an election, such a divided time. What would it be like if everyone didn't believe everything they thought?
It would be a radically different world with a lot more peace, a lot less drama, a lot less suffering. And all these, like we're talking about, made up words, things that exist in the abstract world, but they don't exist in reality. Republican, Democrat, the whole political spheres.
Made up.
None of it's not real, in the sense that these things cannot be directly experienced.
Yeah. And inner and outer peace. Yeah. And by the way, to your point, that's when all the data comes. That's when all the ideas come. It's not that everybody's sitting around, oming all day long. It's when actually inspiration happens. And it's like you just intuitively know what to do next. Love it. Thank you, Chris, so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Abby. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.